On a chilly winter evening in New York, the streets buzzed with holiday shoppers. The city was alive with vibrant lights and laughter, but not everyone was wrapped in warmth or joy. Among the shadows of towering skyscrapers and the cold concrete of the urban jungle, a little girl named Lily wandered aimlessly. She was no more than 10, with tangled hair and eyes that reflected pain far beyond her years. Her clothes were ragged, barely enough to shield her from the biting wind. Lily had no home to return to, no family waiting for her. Her nights were spent curled up in abandoned alleys under makeshift shelters of cardboard and newspapers. Hunger clawed at her stomach, and exhaustion tugged at her tiny frame. Yet she held on to a faint hope, a hope that someday her life might change. That evening, Lily's feet led her to an upscale neighborhood she had never dared venture into before. It was a world of glimmering mansions and sleek luxury cars, a world so far removed from her harsh reality that it felt like a dream. The little girl stopped in her tracks when she spotted a black luxury car parked outside an enormous mansion. Its polished surface gleamed under the streetlights, and its interior looked like a cozy haven. Driven by desperation, Lily approached the car. Peering inside, she noticed the plush leather seats and the warmth radiating from within. The car's owner had accidentally left it unlocked. Shivering uncontrollably, Lily couldn't resist the temptation. She climbed into the back seat, curling up as small as she could, and allowed herself to drift into a fitful sleep. Inside the mansion, Alexander Harper, a self-made millionaire, was hosting a lavish dinner party. At 42, he was one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the city, known for his sharp business acumen and his relentless pursuit of perfection. His life was the picture of luxury, tailored suits, exotic vacations, and a sprawling estate that reflected his hard-earned wealth. Yet, beneath the polished exterior, Alexander felt a gnawing emptiness. He rarely admitted it, but his life lacked genuine connection. Success had come at a cost. His long hours and cutthroat attitude had driven away friends, and his estranged family had given up trying to reach him. As the evening wore on, Alexander decided to step outside for some fresh air. The festivities were draining him, as they often did. He walked down the steps of his mansion toward the driveway, intending to take a quiet drive. But as he approached his car, something caught his eye. Through the tinted windows of his luxury vehicle, Alexander noticed a faint movement. His heart skipped a beat as he leaned closer. At first, he thought it might be an animal, but then he saw her, Lily, huddled on the back seat, clutching her knees to her chest. Her small body trembled as she murmured softly in her sleep, tears streaking her dirt-smudged face. Alexander's initial reaction was a mix of shock and irritation. Who is this child, and how did she get into my car? His first instinct was to wake her and demand answers, but as he opened the door and crouched down, he paused. The sight of her frailty, her vulnerability, struck a chord deep within him. For a moment, Alexander simply watched her. She looked so out of place, a child in the sanctuary of his car, a stark contrast to the life he had built for himself. He was reminded of his own childhood, of struggles he had buried beneath layers of success. Then, Lily stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, wide with fear, as she saw the imposing figure of Alexander towering over her. "Please don't hurt me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She tried to scramble away, but there was nowhere to go. Alexander raised a hand, signaling her to stop. "Calm down," he said, his voice low but firm. "You're not in trouble. I just want to know why you're here." Tears welled up in Lily's eyes as she stammered, I didn't mean to. It was so cold and the car looked warm. I'm sorry." Her words hung in the air, raw and heart-wrenching. Alexander felt an unfamiliar pang in his chest, a mixture of guilt, pity, and something else he couldn't quite name. He knew he couldn't leave her out in the cold, but taking her into his world would be a risk, a disruption to his meticulously controlled life. The air between them grew heavy as Alexander struggled with his next move. But as he looked at the frightened child before him, he knew he couldn't simply turn her away. For the first time in years, his heart made the decision. "Come with me," he said, extending his hand toward her. Lily hesitated, staring at his outstretched hand with mistrust. But desperation and exhaustion overruled her caution. Slowly, she placed her small, trembling hand in his. As they walked toward the mansion, neither of them could have predicted how this fateful encounter would change their lives forever. Alexander led Lily into the grand mansion, her tiny hand trembling in his. The opulence of the house was overwhelming for her. Every corner glimmered with wealth she couldn't fathom. Crystal chandeliers hung from high ceilings, and the polished floors gleamed like mirrors. Lily's eyes darted around, unable to fully process the luxury surrounding her. She instinctively pulled back, unsure if she belonged in such a place. Alexander noticed her hesitation, but didn't say anything at first. He guided her to the kitchen, where the remnants of the evening's feast were still being cleared away by staff. Lily froze, her wide eyes scanning the trays of untouched food. The aroma made her stomach ache with hunger, but she didn't dare say a word. He gestured toward a seat at the counter. "Sit," he said. His voice wasn't harsh, but it carried a weight that made Lily obey without question. Alexander called for his housekeeper, Mrs. Collins, who had worked for him for over a decade. She was a kind-hearted woman in her 60s, and her brow furrowed with concern when she saw Lily. "Bring her something to eat," Alexander instructed. Mrs. Collins didn't ask questions. She quickly prepared a plate of warm food and placed it in front of the girl. Lily hesitated, her hands hovering over the plate as if waiting for someone to snatch it away. When no one did, she began to eat, slowly at first, then ravenously. Tears slid down her cheeks as she ate, but she said nothing. Neither did Alexander, who watched her in silence. Mrs. Collins leaned toward him and whispered, "Who is she?" "I don't know," he replied, keeping his voice low. "I found her in my car." Mrs. Collins frowned, but didn't press further. She could see there was more to the story than Alexander was letting on, but she trusted his judgment, even if it often leaned toward the unconventional. When Lily had finished eating, Alexander asked, "What's your name?" She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and murmured, "Lily." "Lily," he repeated, as if testing the weight of her name. "Where are your parents?" Her gaze dropped to her lap, and she fidgeted with the edge of her worn sweater. I don't have any." The room fell silent. Alexander's chest tightened at her words. He had heard countless tragic stories in his life, but something about this little girl sitting in his kitchen struck him differently. "What happened to them?" he pressed gently. Lily hesitated, her voice trembling as she spoke. "My mum, she got sick. We didn't have money for a doctor. And my dad, he left before I can even remember. After my mum died, I had nowhere to go." The raw pain in her voice hit Alexander harder than he expected. He leaned back in his chair, suddenly feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. "You've been living on the streets?" he asked. Lily nodded, her eyes welling up again. "I try to stay out of trouble. I don't steal, I promise. I didn't know what else to do." Alexander's mind raced. He had no idea what to do with a homeless child. His life was built on order and discipline, not compassion or care. But as he looked at Lily, he couldn't bring himself to send her back to the streets. "You'll stay here tonight," he finally said, his voice firm. "We'll figure everything else out in the morning." Lily's head snapped up, her expression a mix of disbelief and cautious hope. "Really?" "Really," Alexander replied, surprising even himself with the certainty in his tone. Mrs. Collins showed Lily to a guest room, where the bed was made with crisp white sheets and soft pillows. It was more luxurious than anything Lily had ever seen, let alone slept on. She climbed onto the bed hesitantly, running her fingers over the fabric as if it might disappear. Alexander stood in the doorway, watching her settle in. She looked so small and fragile, lost in the expanse of the oversized bed. For a brief moment, he wondered if he was making a mistake. But then, Lily turned to him, her voice soft as she said, "Thank you." The sincerity in her words pierced through him, and he gave a small nod before leaving the room. As he walked back to his study, his mind swirled with questions. Who was this girl really? Could he trust her? And why had fate chosen him, of all people, to cross her path? He poured himself a glass of whiskey and stared out the window into the night. For years, he had built walls around himself, keeping the world at arm's length. Yet, in a single evening, a little girl had managed to slip through those defenses. Alexander didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in years, he felt something stir within him, a sense of purpose he thought he had lost long ago. As the night deepened, Lily lay in her bed, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, but her heart lighter than it had been in years. For the first time since her mother's death, she felt safe. Little did she know, this was only the beginning of a journey that would change both her life and Alexander's forever. The morning sunlight streamed through the grand windows of the mansion, casting a warm glow over its polished surfaces. Lily stirred in the soft bed, her small frame buried beneath the plush comforter. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming. The warmth, the softness, the quiet. All of it felt surreal compared to the harsh, cold reality she was used to. Then she remembered the man from last night. Alexander Harper. Her heart quickened. Was he still going to let her stay, or had he changed his mind? The thought of being sent back to the streets sent a shiver through her, despite the comfort of the room. A gentle knock on the door startled her. Before she could respond, Mrs. Collins peeked inside, holding a tray of food. "Good morning, dear," the housekeeper said, with a kind smile. "I brought you some breakfast." Lily sat up hesitantly, unsure how to respond. No one had ever served her food before. She managed a quiet, "Thank you." As she ate, Mrs. Collins watched her with a mixture of curiosity and compassion. "Mr. Harper asked me to make sure you're comfortable. He'll speak with you later." Lily nodded, though her nerves made it hard to eat. She couldn't shake the feeling that her time in this haven was temporary, that at any moment the rug would be pulled out from under her. Downstairs, Alexander was already in his study, pacing back and forth. He had spent the night wrestling with what to do next. Taking Lily in, even temporarily, was a decision that felt both right and reckless. He wasn't equipped to care for a child, especially one with such a complicated past. When Mrs. Collins entered to update him, he turned to her, his expression a mix of frustration and concern. "I can't just send her back out there, but what am I supposed to do? She's a child, not a stray animal I can just adopt." Mrs. Collins raised an eyebrow, unfazed by his sharp tone. "She's not expecting you to have all the answers, sir. She just needs someone to care." Her words lingered as Alexander made his way to the living room, where Lily was now waiting. She sat on the edge of the oversized couch, her small hands clasped tightly in her lap. When she saw him enter, she stood immediately, her nervous energy filling the room. "Sit down," he said gently, gesturing to the couch. She obeyed, but her posture remained stiff. Alexander sat across from her, studying her for a moment before speaking. "Lily, I need to ask you some questions. I need to understand what's happened to you." Her eyes darted to the floor, and for a moment, it seemed like she wouldn't answer. But then, in a quiet voice, she began to speak. "I've been on my own since my mom died," she said, her voice trembling. "I tried staying with people she knew, but it never worked out. Some were mean, others just didn't want me." Alexander's jaw tightened. He had seen the harsh realities of the world before, but hearing them from a child was something else entirely. "Why didn't anyone help you?" he asked, his voice soft but laced with frustration. Lily shrugged, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "People don't want someone like me. I'm just a burden." The words hit Alexander like a punch to the gut. He had spent his life surrounded by power and privilege, yet here was a little girl who had been discarded by society, left to fend for herself. "You're not a burden," he said firmly, surprising himself with the conviction in his tone. "No one deserves to be treated like that." Lily looked up at him, her expression a mix of disbelief and hope. She wanted to believe him, but years of rejection had left her wary. "Lily," he continued, leaning forward, "I don't know what the future looks like for you or for me, but I promise you this: you're safe here, at least for now." Her lip quivered as she tried to hold back tears. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. That day marked the beginning of an uneasy arrangement. Alexander found himself thrust into a role he had never imagined. A reluctant guardian to a child who needed far more than he knew how to give. Lily, meanwhile, struggled to adjust to life in the mansion. The warmth and security were foreign to her, and she often caught herself expecting it to be taken away. But Mrs. Collins was a steady source of comfort, treating Lily with the kindness she hadn't experienced in years. As days turned into weeks, Lily began to open up more. She shared stories of her mother, of the nights they spent laughing despite having so little. Alexander listened intently, his own childhood memories surfacing in unexpected ways. Yet, the arrangement wasn't without its challenges. Lily's presence disrupted Alexander's carefully ordered life, and more than once, he questioned whether he had made the right decision. His business associates raised eyebrows, and whispers began to circulate about the mystery girl living in his home. Despite the challenges, something began to shift. Alexander, who had once prided himself on his detachment, found himself caring deeply for Lily. She reminded him of the parts of himself he had buried, the vulnerability, the hope, the humanity. But the past has a way of catching up, and as Lily began to feel at home, a shadow loomed over their fragile peace. Unbeknownst to them, someone from Lily's past had taken notice of her sudden disappearance, and they weren't about to let her go so easily. The days passed in a blur of new routines and small victories. Lily was becoming more accustomed to her new life in the mansion, though her past still lingered in the shadows of her mind. Mrs. Collins had taken on a role that felt almost like a grandmother, teaching Lily how to properly care for herself, and even finding ways to put a smile on her face. Lily had started school, and while she was hesitant at first, she quickly began to thrive in the more structured environment. Alexander, though still unsure of what exactly he was doing, had made it his mission to ensure Lily was well cared for. But with each passing day, he found himself more deeply invested in her future, which was starting to feel less like a charity and more like a calling. It was as if she had become a part of him, a part of his life that he couldn't walk away from, no matter how much he might want to. There were nights when he would sit in his study, the weight of the responsibility pressing down on him, yet a sense of fulfillment would take over when he saw her smiling, her laughter ringing through the halls. However, trouble was never far behind. One afternoon, As Lily was playing in the garden, a visitor arrived at the mansion. He was a tall, imposing man in a dark suit, and his cold, calculating eyes fixed immediately on Alexander when the door opened. His name was Thomas, and he was a figure from Lily's past, a person with a claim on her that Alexander had never expected. "I need to speak with you," Thomas said, his voice firm as he stepped past the butler who had opened the door for him. "It's about the girl." Alexander's heart sank. He had hoped that Lily's past wouldn't come back to haunt her, but it seemed fate had other plans. "What about her?" Alexander asked, trying to maintain his composure. Thomas crossed his arms, studying Alexander with an unsettling stare. "She's my niece. Her mother was my sister. You have no right to keep her. She belongs with me." The words struck Alexander like a slap across the face. He had been under the assumption that Lily had no family left, that she had been alone in the world. This revelation shook him to his core, and his first instinct was to protect her, to keep her safe from anyone who might try to take her away. "I'm sorry," Alexander said, his voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of anger. "Lily has been living here under my care for weeks. She has no interest in going back to you, and I won't let you take her from here." Thomas's eyes narrowed. "You don't get to decide that," he sneered. "If you know what's good for you, you'll let me have her. Otherwise, you'll regret it." Alexander didn't back down, but inside, a storm of fear and doubt began to churn. He knew the man before him was dangerous. He could see it in his eyes. Someone who wasn't used to being denied. Someone who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. But Alexander wasn't about to let Lily go without a fight. He couldn't. The next few days were tense. Alexander, fearing for Lily's safety, took immediate action. He consulted with his lawyers, making sure that every legal measure was in place to keep her in his care. He contacted the authorities, warning them about Thomas's threats. The mansion, which had once been a symbol of security and peace, now felt like a fortress under siege. Despite the mounting tension, Alexander spent every moment with Lily. He assured her that she was safe, though deep down he couldn't promise her that forever. He could see the worry in her eyes, the faint trace of fear that seemed to follow her wherever she went. In the days that followed, Alexander confronted Thomas one more time, but this time he was ready. He had spoken with a lawyer who knew Thomas's history and had uncovered the darker side of his intentions. Alexander confronted him with the truth, exposing his past of neglect and manipulation. He presented evidence that Thomas was not fit to care for Lily, and when the authorities got involved, Thomas's claims quickly fell apart. In the end, the law sided with Alexander, and Thomas was forced to back off, disappearing from their lives. Lily was safe, for good. The finality of it all hit Alexander like a wave crashing against the shore. It was over. Lily was his now, legally and forever. There were still many challenges ahead, but for the first time in months, Alexander felt like he could breathe again. He could offer Lily the stability she deserved. Lily, too, felt a deep sense of relief. She had spent so long feeling like a burden, like she had no place in the world. But now, she had a future, one filled with love and promise. As she stood in the grand garden, looking at the flowers that had bloomed just like she had, she whispered softly, "Thank you." Alexander, who had been watching her from the doorway, stepped forward and said, "You don't need to thank me, Lily. You belong here." And just like that, the bond between them solidified. A bond forged in adversity, built on trust, and above all, love. This story may have come to an end, but remember, the journey to create such stories takes time and effort. If you enjoyed watching this heartfelt journey unfold, please consider subscribing to this channel. Your support means everything, and it helps us continue to create stories that inspire, that touch hearts and that remind us of the power of kindness and hope. Thank you for being part of this journey. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that will move and inspire you. It really does take a lot to bring these stories to life, and your support helps us keep going.